It is the number one cause of death for women. It's terrifying. So if you're in a world where the main goddess of this, not just the city, but known all over the empire, is the goddess of midwifery, who either saves you through childbearing or kills you quickly with her euthanizing arrows, she's where you're going to go. She's the temple you're going to go to. Not just women, but men and women love her. We found lots of men named after her. It's not just a girl cult. So Paul, the good pastor, is looking at these Gentile women saying, I care about your biggest fear, and Jesus is better. And I think it's also really possible he's telling Timothy, these women are not going to die. That's not for all time, any more than in Acts when you have the magic workers and people touch something Paul touched and they are healed. We don't make that for all time. It is a in your face to the magic workers that Jesus is stronger.
Well, hey guys, this is Josh Burtram. I'm your host here for another amazing episode of the Faith Roundtable. I'm also, of course, the faithful host of the Faithful Politics podcast. So make sure you guys are liking and subscribing to the channel, hack the algorithm so we can get all this stuff out there for people, because we like to get you great content. And it's very much the same thing here on Faith Roundtable. We're trying to bring scholars and leaders, thought leaders, theologians to you guys to talk about the issues, trending issues, and theological issues and biblical issues facing the church today. And I'm very excited to have on the program with me Dr. Sandra Glahn. She began her career in HR and financial services, publishing, and an encouraging boss sent her to study with a best-selling author and launch a freelance business that would sharpen her craft. She edited with DTS magazine for 17 years. That's Dallas Theological Seminary. And she earned a seminary degree and now teaches writing, gender studies, and public speaking at the master's and doctoral levels. Sandra leads study trips to Italy, the UK, Mexico, and has written or co-written 20 plus books, many born from her own journey through infertility and focused on women, gender, and justice in Scripture's cultural world. She loves guiding others to engage the text thoughtfully and share her insights in print. And today we get to talk to her about one of her latest books, Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament. Sandra, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's really great to have you. Can't wait to dig into this.
Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. So I just want to get right into the content, and I want to ask you, what inspired you to write a book about Artemis of the Ephesians? It might not be the most regular, table conversation of all the gods. You got Zeus.
Still a table conversation.
You have Zeus. You have Hera. You have the underworld guy. What's going on with Artemis? Why are we talking about her?
Well, it comes right out of Acts 19, as I'm sure you know, a little brouhaha happening in the city of Ephesus. But you asked me what drove me to it. What drove me to it was my own journey with infertility and pregnancy loss that spanned 10 years and raised a lot of ethical and spiritual questions. One of them, what is that phrase, a woman will be saved through childbearing, in 1 Timothy? If you can't have kids, then you start looking at what does saved really mean there. And so how did that lead to Artemis? Well, 1 Timothy is written to Timothy. Chapter 1, verse 3 says, I left you in Ephesus to teach certain people not to teach false doctrine. So then I would what is the false doctrine in Ephesus? And you go over to Acts 19 and it outlines, you got a lot of magic, you got Artemis worship. So then that leads to, who's Artemis? And are there whispers of Artemis showing up in 1 Timothy? And as it turns out, she is the goddess, not of fertility, as a lot of people have thought for a long time. She's a goddess of midwifery, though. And it's the difference between a doula and a delivery nurse or a delivery doctor.
Right.
You don't necessarily yourself have fertility or delivery. As a doula, you are delivering, but you're not necessarily giving birth. So all of that is a long way around saying it was a spiritual quest to find out what does that mean. And that led me to, you would think the background's first, but actually it led me to Acts 19, to see a huge section on the background of Ephesus.
That's so interesting. I love one thing I really love about your book is I love any book, one that takes a fresh look at something. And we have all these assumptions about the Bible, assumptions about what it says. And yet so much of what we've gotten, of course, is tradition, which is great in one sense, but it has to be critically examined. And we get things that start to take hold, and then these trends and views, they are there throughout history and millennium, and we assume because something is old it's true, and yet there are reconsiderations that are made and new insights that come up, and this is very much in that vein. I would love for you, well, one, thank you for sharing your story. My wife and I, we lost a child in between our first two, and it was just awful. And that was my small but profound door and window into the pain of infertility, the pain of loss of children, and all of the dangers and risks with pregnancy. Our first pregnancy, we're like, this is great, this is awesome, nothing went wrong, and we thought. And then our second one, it was really tough. And so that one forever kind of changed my view of pregnancy. And of course, pregnancy in the ancient world was
Yeah, it's the
far
number one cause
more,
of death for women. Yeah.
yeah, like far more precarious
Oh.
and dangerous, truly life risking. So I would love for you to even speak on that, the ideas around like childbirth and how this view of being saved through childbirth took the view it did that essentially has lasted with us all the way to today.
Well,
What's
interestingly
going
enough,
on
yeah,
there?
I am a great respecter of tradition and history, and I know that you are too. But that also, we would never have had the Protestant Reformation, right? If we only believed in those things. So there actually is not one view that has been carried all the way through history on what it means to be saved through childbearing. And it's a fairly recent view that says a woman with the gift of teaching is to channel that gift through her nuclear family. That is a very post-Reformation view, because prior to
Hmm.
the Reformation, we have monasteries full of nuns and monks, which we empty at the time of the Reformation, and we swing from celibacy as the end-all be-all to marriage and family is the end-all be-all. We need a little balance there, right? But Paul gives a rationale for why he's saying, I want women, or maybe wives, it's the same word in Greek, so we kind of need to figure out context. And the fact that it has childbearing in view would maybe lean it toward wives. So he could be just talking to wives rather than all women. But anyway, he's limiting some speech, but he's giving a rationale, and he's saying what for. Adam was first, and also the woman was deceived. Um, but she'll be saved through childbearing. You're like, what does all that mean? And for centuries, the emphasis has been on the woman was deceived. So there was a thinking by many, not all, but by many, that maybe woman wasn't fully made in the image of God. Women are more easily deceived than men. And as we've had more women get educated, particularly theologically, and we have men and women at the table, then it's getting a little harder to say women are more easily deceived. In a world like Paul was in, where the average woman is probably marrying at 13 to 15 years old, and she's marrying a 30-year-old man, you can see why they thought women weren't as smart as men. They just didn't have as much experience. It's not true that women in the ancient world couldn't be educated, but it is more of an upper class thing. And so what happens when we start realizing women are made in the image of God, and they are not always more easily deceived than all men, then we shift to the first phrase there, which was Adam was first. And that has been the emphasis, a more recent emphasis on firstness and seeing creation order as hierarchy, and seeing then that Paul must be limiting the woman because the man is in charge and has been since before the fall. The challenge to that is God was calling women prophets all the way through, right? You've got Miriam, you've got Huldah, you even in the church age, you have, the women in Corinth that are supposed to cover their head, but it's assumed they're going to pray and prophesy. You have Philip's 4 daughters.
Yes.
Why would God be calling women to speak for God publicly, Deborah, if it's rooted in creation order that they're not supposed to? So that's what's the more recent emphasis, I will say. And so here's what I think is happening is as you mentioned, childbirth is very risky. It is the number one cause of death for women. It's terrifying. So if you're in a world where the main goddess of this, not just the city, but known all over the empire, is the goddess of midwifery, who either saves you through childbearing or kills you quickly with her euthanizing arrows, she's where you're going to go. She's the temple you're going to go to. Not just women, but men and women love her. We found lots of men named after her. It's not just a girl cult. So Paul, the good pastor, is looking at these Gentile women saying, I care about your biggest fear, and Jesus is better. And I think it's also really possible he's telling Timothy, these women are not going to die. That's not for all time, any more than in Acts when you have the magic workers and people touch something Paul touched and they are healed. We don't make that for all time. It is in your face to the magic workers that Jesus is stronger. And I think it's entirely possible that the second part of that narrative about Ephesus that emphasizes great is Artemis of the Ephesians could be that Jesus is stronger than Artemis, and we're just not going to see this, Christian women dying left and right in childbirth because they're failing to worship the goddess.
I mean, I just think that is such a cool perspective. One thing that I would love to do, one thing you outline, I think it's in chapter 1, is you talk about the decline of, like, essentially this female deacons, people in leadership. I think you outlined 4. I might be wrong. You can correct on that. Yeah. But like male-only priesthood, a shift to infant baptism, temple purity logic, like kind of the menstruation, and Aristotelian defect. And I know that's all a bit, but I think it's super important for people to see the historical shifts that happen, these patterns that happen that then create these massive trends and massive shifts in, watershed moments. And I would love for you to talk about that a little bit, like that logic and how that endured.
We start by asking, what were women doing in the early church? And one of the challenges for us is in the West, we've looked at when did deacons start, female deacons. And I should pause here and say that it's not like there's a word for teacher and teachess, that there's a feminine ending. The word deacon applies to men and women. And so that's why I think in 1 Timothy, Paul says, to the deacons and the women, just to clarify, he's talking about females. And so we ask, when did the deacons show up? And they're not going to show up for the 3rd or 4th century for women. So we've assumed that was a new thing. What we weren't doing was looking at the East. And it's been easier since the Iron Curtain fell. And the internet. You combine those two, then we start getting a lot more of, what were the Orthodox practices? And in the East, it looks like there was an order of widows that was rooted in 1 Timothy 5, which talks about, and it lays out qualifications. Did she wash the feet of, the saints? Did she raise children? Was she the wife of one husband, which is very parallel to the elder qualifications?
Yes.
And she had to be 60 years old. So you're combining the fact that there are all these single older women in the church needing to be fed, but also there are qualifications for vetting them. And they take an oath that basically says, I won't remarry. And some have looked at Paul's reference to the oath and assumed he's talking about their original marriage vow. But it can't be that, because a few verses later, he says, I want the widow, the younger widows to remarry.
Right.
And that's interesting, because in Corinth, he's saying, consider staying single. And in Ephesus, he's saying, I want you to, there's clearly something different happening in the city's emphases. Paul doesn't contradict himself. Scripture doesn't contradict himself, but certainly he personalizes his pastoral care advice to whatever the strongholds are in a city. So we see in the East this order of widows, and it looks like the widows are baptizing the women, and they're discipling the women, and they are catechizing, if you will, the women. And when we have the shift to infant baptism, it begins the elimination of a need, it's seen, for women, because men aren't going to be touching a grown woman's body as she's going into baptism, but they're fine handling a baby. So that's the first thing we have to ask. Well, but do we believe infant baptism is right? Then you combine that, as you mentioned, with a sort of a shift back to more Old Testament laws. So you start seeing women who are menstruating kept out of the physical space of where the church, outside of the doors. And that also is not biblical. Right? Hello, Galatians, the book of Galatians is all about dealing with Christ has fulfilled the law. It's not that the law was evil, it was beautiful. That's in Romans, but Christ is the fulfillment of the law. We don't go back to we eat pork. Peter had to learn what he thought was unclean is not clean. So you have that. You have that the early Christians were very influenced by Aristotle and his thinking, which was, to put it in lay terms, a woman to Aristotle is an undercooked cookie. That if the ideal is a chocolate chip cookie that is crisp, a woman is the gooey kind, which I actually prefer, but that's beside the point. A woman is moist where a man is dry. And of course, a very ancient physiology that, is uninformed. Yes. And so this idea, particularly, Augustine, who is a very broken man sexually, is pretty influenced by Aristotle. And then Aquinas later is very influenced by Aristotle. For centuries, the world has lost Aristotle, but the Arab world has those records. And it gets rediscovered really in the era of Aquinas in the Middle Ages. And he is a fan of Aristotle, which Aristotle has a lot of great logic, as does Aquinas. But the challenge of that is that we are bringing in a pagan anthropology of women, and it's influencing how we think about women. So when you combine all of these factors, this sort of morphing of the office of widows into the office of deacons, deaconesses, and then the idea through time that deacon for women is a later thing, instead of seeing that the church originally had mothers and fathers that were vetted for office. We have an ordination prayer from the 5th century to the office of widow for women. And the same word, or Latin word for ordain, is showing up as ordaining the other offices. And it just makes sense, right? That the church would have elderly, older, wiser mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers. We're not a single parent family. And that it was really more segregated. Not that we need to segregate. It's just that it was understood that a better person to train a woman to be a wife and mother is a woman, training her to be a wife and mother. We have lots to learn from our brothers, but also imagine if I was doing seminars on how to be a husband and father. Like, what?
Right.
I'm sure I have things I could add, but come on.
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
I love that.
We need each other.
Yes, we absolutely do. And, it's one thing I really appreciated is thinking about these modern catalysts for reexamination. You talk about some of these things, like I think you mentioned, like the internet, that we have a longer life for women. And so someone, I think mentioned could get their PhD in their 40s and still have 30 to 40 years of good, career left. And that was not probably an option in the ancient world. So you have a lot of different things that have kind of really catalyzed this reexamination. I would love for you to kind of talk about that a little more and the significance of that, not only for this, but how, when we look at any controversial issue and passage, how does this speak to us today?
I think anytime we look at a controversial passage, it's really important to have as many people at the table that are affected by it as possible. If we're going to
Hmm.
talk about reproductive health, let's have men and women at the table. That's just on a
Yes.
political level, right? And so if we are going to talk about racism, let's not have only one race in the room talking about
Right.
racism. Let's sit down at the table and hear lots of different perspectives. We saw this as we started having more African Christians in our American seminaries. We got the African Study Bible that's looking, at just perspectives that we need. And it's a beautiful thing. I think it's rooted in revelation that, every tribe and nation is the ideal in the kingdom. And so we are looking at, as you mentioned, so let's just take the internet. When my brother earned his PhD a couple decades before I did, when he would need something from France, he would write it, go get a translator, mail it, wait 6 weeks for an answer. I would go to Google Translate, find their email on the Academy
It's
website,
amazing.
and have an answer when I got up in the morning. So these collaborations internationally were exponentially aided by that. In addition, I could find an obscure journal like the Journal of Anatolian Studies that I never would have had access to. But they're in Anatolia looking at Ephesus. And I
Hmm.
would never have known about it. It has a small distribution, but I had access to that because of the internet that allowed me access to all kinds of library space. So the combination of scholars collaborating and the access to tools that we didn't used to have, plus Google Translate, means that all these pockets of research that didn't know about each other can correct each other, modify each other, validate each other. And so academically, it's a wonderful time to be relooking at or modifying or adjusting. And so in my own case, this was part of what helped me see that Artemis was not a fertility goddess. She was a goddess of midwifery, because I could look up online a search of what did Homer say about Artemis? What did he say about Artemis of the Ephesians? And how might that be different than the generic Artemis? It meant I didn't have to move to Ephesus to read the inscriptions that were in Ephesus. They're in a database. So I could sit in my jammies in my living room with my laptop and be translating what the inscription said at the time of Paul. That would have required people to move in the past. And then let's put a face on it. I had a student in her 50s who had left a high powered Manhattan career to raise her kids, convinced that that was the thing a godly woman should do. And kids were raised, happily married, and comes in and says, my kids don't want to hang out with me anymore. What did I do wrong? I'm like, success. Like, they're happily married. They're hanging out with their families. Like, they love you, but your job on a daily basis is done. And she said, then my life is over. Because as the Protestant church, we had not cast any sort of vision beyond parenting and motherhood. And so after about a year of relooking at where am I gifted? What do I love to do? She's thriving, just
Hmm.
thriving, and has just entered a doctoral program and can't wait. But she had no vision for who she could be apart from being a wife and mother, because she rightly valued that. But that was the only vision we were casting. And this is part of women living longer. If most of you die in
Yes.
childbirth, and those of you do survive or washing your clothes down in the river and you're exhausted, not a lot of you are going to live past 60 or 70. But if we are able to sit behind a laptop, even if we can't walk anymore, and our minds are still engaged and we can still interact and study, then that does open up years and years of study. And one of the things that the women have brought to their influx in the academy is lots of PhDs on subjects like who were the early widows? Where did they live? What do the tombstones say about them? When did women deacons sort of replace the widows and
Hmm.
where? And what do the stained glass windows and the statues tell us about women? Why do we have women in the church in Oxford holding shepherd staffs, which means pastoral, in the 7th century? And why didn't I know that?
I mean, that is, I think that is it's so good, but that's not really the adjective I'm looking for. It's so informative. And it brings to my mind this sense that, with the amount of change that truly has happened, obviously we know that there are certain human conditions that we share with the original audience,
Sure.
certain emotions, certain human, we have the same brain, we have the same,
We love our
probably
children.
basic needs, right? Yeah, all that kind of stuff.
We
Yet
want
the
safety.
worlds are so different. And that means that that any kind of letter that would be addressing specific issues is going to have to be understood within that context of what those specific issues are, which bring things to light like women were probably 13 to 15 when they got married. They didn't often live past 45 to 50, although, some did, right? But there was a large, an issue of mortality and how different our society truly is that creates practical problems that these old theological solutions, because the context was maybe more similar, didn't don't work anymore, and maybe they never should have worked, and I'm just thinking of some of the ways that women were excluded, right? I'm not saying that that was the right thing to do. I'm saying that like now when we're looking at it, it's even clearer that like, hey, there's an issue here that we gotta work through. Some of these older interpretations, they're just not working, and it creates this tension because you want to understand the Bible and you want to understand what it's saying, you want to apply it to today, but it really is not as simple at all as just I'm going to read this and then have like a direct literal to literal application.
I mean, if we
Women need
just
to
do
stay
that, we're
silent
going
in
to
the
believe in
church.
slavery, right?
Right. So like that, I would love for you to take a moment and help us work through that. Like as a scholar who's worked through this really controversial issue, worked through this interpretation that was very long in its endurance and its staying power, and then having to come against that and use evidence and use understanding and constantly be putting in the balance today's world and that world. What is that like? What kind of like how has that been instructive for you in terms of
Interestingly enough,
applying?
I have come out with an even stronger view of the inspiration of Scripture. A lot of the more liberal, excuse me, liberal scholars think that First Timothy wasn't written by Paul. And I
Right,
think this evidence, and the reason being, he uses a different vocabulary in the
right,
pastorals than he uses in his earlier letters. Like, well, if he is addressing a different issue, and he's talking to somebody who's worked tightly
right,
with him for a couple of years, he needs to include less background information. He can use
right.
a shared vocabulary. If I say the word kryptonite to you, I don't have to tell you who I'm talking about because you live in
Totally.
a culture where you know what superhero I have in mind. But imagine 1,000 years from now, somebody who's never heard of Superman goes, "That's a really rare word. Where's that coming from?" So there's that. But also, I think it does point to the fact that in many of these conversations, women were not at the table. But Genesis says it's not good for a man to be alone, and it's not good for a woman to be alone. We need each other. We don't have to understand the mystery of how we're different. We just acknowledge that we are, and we are beautifully so. But also, maybe if we're going to be talking about women, women should be at the table. And not because they're
Yes.
more easily deceived, right? But because it's harder to look your sisters in the eye and go, they're more easily deceived. Like,
Yes.
especially if they know Genesis. So I think part of that is coming away with more convinced than ever that Paul, when it says it's Paul, it's Paul. And also, I see much more of Paul's pastoral heart now. If I see if that he is concerned for the number one thing that would have been their fear, and he's addressing their fear, while also shutting down conversation until they can learn, because they are not learned and something's disruptive in the congregation. So he's addressing the problem, but also giving a consolation, and that's
I,
great pastoral advice, right?
yes.
Excellent, like hold the sound doctrine, but also, mitigate and address the fears. And what would make an Ephesian Gentile new convert terrified to follow Jesus? Well, she's afraid she's going to die. So, right. I mean, that
Or
is
that
really what
Artemis of
ever.
so the idea is that Artemis would not be there to help her. Is that kind
Correct.
of like
Oh yeah, if you hacked off the goddess by saying she's not real, then either you're going to die, or more terrifying, actually, is you're going to ride for 9 days before you die, right? We have C-sections in this world, and probably considering how thin walls are in urban areas, everybody's heard a woman screaming to death. It's terrifying. It is just a different world. So I think that's part of it. Also, I think it's really important that we know history. A lot of our church history has been actually just the history of the creeds, which is really important, and the decisions that are made by councils. But that, to me, is like only knowing the elder board problem notes instead of the church bulletin. That also includes who's being prayed for, who's being visited, how are we training the children in the faith? What's the last potluck? Are we going to have vacation Bible school? Like, hardly any of that shows up in elder board notes. And so, again, but the visual record shows us a lot of the beauty of the church and what's happening. And so, and even the architecture, some of the early churches we can date because they're 8-sided, and the number 8 was considered the first day of eternity. And so we can figure out what year that church was constructed based on what its physical structure is. And I think one of the things I've loved about studying the early church visually, and I take students to Italy to do this, is to see how much gender pairing there is in the art. You have men and women at the altar serving communion. You have men and women flanking the walls. Like in Ravenna, there are 22 women on one side led by the 3 wise men. Those are the women of the East. And you got 27 or 25 men on the right flanking the upper side of the church. So when you walk into church to worship, literally their names and faces are appearing. And so their stories. Well, the Protestant Reformation rightly got rid of calling people saints because we're all saints, but wrongly threw out the biographies when we did that. So we don't know the stories of that. Everybody would have known. They would have known the name of Thecla and Pudenziana and Praxedes and Martin of Tours, and we might know Valentine and Patrick because they got great holidays. But other than that, we got rid of all the saints' days, and we don't know who they are. We need to recover them.
That's so amazing. It's just so, well, it is fascinating to look at how history moves and how you can look here, right, and have a certain interpretation that's come to you, and then go back and see like this archaeological evidence or this art or inscriptions or whatever, or this way that it's portrayed. And then you ask the question, well, why is it that women and men are there, and then we're said that they're different, or that women weren't able to be in those spaces, but this seems to contradict that, which then brings out this thing of like, well, you have your tradition, you have the way things were written, you have like the textual evidence, and then you have the archaeological evidence, the material culture things like the art that you look at, and you have to work through like a detective and a scientist kind of working through this hypothesis, seeing what fits and what doesn't. And I just think that is such a it's important to remember that as we're looking at these things, like this is the result of people working and trying to figure out what's going on here and what's the best interpretation. And so with that, it's not infallible. Each of those interpretations.
Our interpretations are not infallible. Correct. There's one more thing I want to say, and that is we are really aided by having the whole counsel of God. And particularly in the West in the last century, we focused a lot in evangelicalism in the white church on Paul's epistles, which are important. But the black church never lost Exodus. And so it's much easier to read instructions to slaves if you already got in your mind slavery is bad and God is the deliverer out of slavery, and that God is our deliverer, it's one of his names. Or if you've seen all the women prophets in the past, it mitigates against some of that really narrow interpretation when you are reading the whole counsel of God and you're asking, but what about, how can you say it's from creation, if these are all the exceptions, right? Maybe they're not exceptions. Maybe we've misinterpreted this little tiny verse here. Or maybe Paul is writing about slavery in a context where it would kill everyone to try to have an uprising.
Right.
So how do you live within that context? You're respectable. You're the best worker possible.
Yes.
He's not putting an endorsement on slavery, but he's also saying, I'm not going to instruct my sheep to go kill themselves over this cause.
Right. Yeah, a cause that they would not have been able to
No way.
win.
It's not like
They
in the US where,
no.
I mean, it was bad enough here, but you could rise up and not just have everyone murdered.
Yes.
Yeah. You can't
So,
take on Rome.
no, and I want to thinking about like the Rome and the Greco-Roman world, the influence and culture of the Greco-Roman culture. Give us a sense of the city of Ephesus. Like this thing is about Ephesus, Artemis of the Ephesians, and we have Luke's report in Acts 19, and we have the evidence, archaeological evidence, and different data from the past. What's going on in Ephesus at the time Paul gets there
Great
with this
question.
church? Yeah,
So Ephesus is a lot like New York compared to DC in that it's the harbor city, it's the business city, it's not the government city. There's a head of government there, but it is known for being an international commerce center. And I think that is why Paul chose to be there the longest. I mean, he's there a couple of years, right? Because you can export the gospel from there all over the empire. You've got 3 different harbors there. They keep silting up, so that's an issue. But still, like, so if you go there today,
right.
it's pretty far inland. But at the time, it was right on the water. You could sail right up to it. It also has the Temple of Artemis, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it's about 4 times the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. It's ginormous.
Wow.
And it is the central bank of the empire, because you and I could go to a bank that has security, but they didn't have guards. They didn't have banks. So
Right.
the uber wealthy would bring their money there to have it protected and stored. And so you have all this business coming in, all this interaction. And interestingly enough, if we just look at New Testament books, you've got the book of Ephesians written to the Ephesians. You have the some of the pastorals sent to Timothy in Ephesus. You have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John written in surrounding areas like the suburbs of Ephesus. History says that Luke ends up there, that John the apostle ends up there, that therefore Mary ends up there. You have Aquila and Priscilla there for a long time. Like, this is Christianity Central before it moves to Rome. Also, in terms of the goddess Artemis, when we have the recording in Acts that the people are chanting for 2 hours because, Paul has said God's made with hands aren't real gods. He never blasphemes her, never says her name. He's a good Jew. He's not going to say the name of another god. Luke, he's probably Gentile background and he doesn't hesitate, but Paul, you'll never find him writing the name of another god. And so Artemis, they're chanting, great is Artemis, but they're not just stopping there. They're saying Artemis of the Ephesians. So then it's like, well, who is Artemis of the Ephesians compared to generic Artemis? And she has the same backstory, but in the same way that Lady Liberty in Paris is the same statue as Lady Liberty in New York Harbor, but only one of those is connected with immigration. A goddess could take on a local flavor. And the flavor of Artemis in Ephesus is midwifery. And whereas in general the general Artemis is connected with hunting and virginity, the that's generic, but the Artemis of the Ephesians is virginity and midwifery. And she feels sorry for people who get pregnant. But she's not nurturing. Like, she's killed women and children as much as she's killed men. So you fear her. So another thing that's happening is the message that God loves you is unheard of in a pagan mind. The gods are vindictive. The gods have to be placated. The gods, you don't want to speak too loudly of good fortune that you're having, or they might want to even things out. I mean, this is the mentality of a Gentile mind. You also have a pod of Jews in Ephesus who are not part of the way. And that's also a point of conflict. And we see that move from the synagogue to the Hall of Tyrannus. And you also see that it's a Jewish person that's standing up to speak during the brouhaha where everybody's chanting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And it's Alexander. That's a name that shows up later of somebody who does Paul great harm. And it's entirely possible it's the same guy. So there's a Jew the way conflict, and there's a Gentile the way conflict. So the Christians are really in the fire. But
Man.
they're a hardy little band.
So you have this group of Christians. And again, all of this is kind of setting up this sense, the main thrust of your argument. And you go into great detail on the sources and the epigraphic sources, the literary sources, the archaeological sources, which is awesome. We can get into that. But I want to make sure that we do is bring this even to the significance for the interpretation of this very controversial passage. And you have an analytical bridge that you make to 1 Timothy from the ideas that even, I think some of them you just even said, but like, so she's a virgin, she's a midwife, Artemis. There's a lot of wealth in the city, potentially costly garments, apparel. And one thing that you haven't mentioned yet that I'd love for you to give us a little more context on is this connection with the Amazon women. So you hear Amazon women and you just think really huge, muscular, I'm going to kill you, kind of like China, like the wrestler, not the country, the WWE or W. Yeah, like an Amazon woman. I mean, that's like the stereotype caricature. But what's going on with that connection, and how is this significant in connecting us to the passage in 1 Timothy?
So most of us were raised hearing the Amazon myth, but there have been some graves found in the country of Georgia, graves around the Black Sea that would suggest they were real. And that certainly the ancient historians, I'm thinking Pausanias especially, believed they were real. That the connection of the respect coming from the Amazon women to Artemis of the Ephesians, there's a huge connection. I had heard there was not a huge connection and didn't give it any more thought till I actually went to Ephesus and saw it engraved in the stone in the story that is telling the story of the city. So I asked my Muslim guide, who had no irons in this fire, and I said, "Oh, so are we talking? Is that like 4th century?" And they're like, "Oh, no, that would have been at the time of the earliest Christians." Huh? Really? You got the Amazon story engraved in stone telling the story of Ephesus at the time of the earliest Christians. That's very interesting. Now, they were not man-haters. And sometimes people think Artemis is like feminazi man-hater. Not true at all. As I said, I compare it. It's a bad analogy, but the best I know is lots of people, including the Pope who just died, love the Virgin Mary. So just because she's a female and a strong spiritual force does not mean she's for girls only, if that makes sense. This goddess was, there's actually one of Paul's converts or followers, Artemis, who we find in the pastorals mentioned. He's named after Artemis by his parents. Lots of parents naming boys and girls after Artemis. But anyway, there's a huge connection between the Amazons and Artemis. And at least the historians that are recording it about a century after Paul, looking back on it, believe that Amazons were real and that there was a huge connection, and that there's a autonomy. I'd say autonomy rather than authority is the word we should be looking at. We Westerners that have come out of England and think everything is hierarchy tend to see hierarchy everywhere, but I think the concern more than the hierarchy is autonomy, individuality. And you certainly see an autonomy in the culture of Artemis and of the Amazons who worship her.
And so is the idea that there were these young women who were virgins, or maybe they hadn't been married yet, is the idea that they are creating issues within the church out of the model of Artemis, or kind of a usurping authority? How does this help us understand? Yeah, go ahead.
Some hints we get in the letter. We know there are a lot of young widows. And so the first question is, why have they not remarried? Again, this is not a world like yours and mine where you go on a dating app. This is where
Right.
you have an arranged marriage and you can be married in 3 weeks or less, once the decision is made to find a partner. Why are these women not marrying? Why do you have so many older widows that we need to divide them into three groups? Those who have family, those who need, there are just a lot of single women in Ephesus. So then when you ask, are there any forces that we know about in the culture? And the fact that we tend to be like what we worship could explain why Paul is dividing up all these different kinds of single women. The reason we think that the young widows might have been part of the problem in the church is there's a reference to them going house to house, speaking nonsense. Sometimes it gets translated going house to house, gossiping and spreading old wives' tales, which I'm going to just go on the record saying I think that's a kind of misogynistic translation of what's happening. Because one of the roots of those words is the same root for the word for magic that Luke uses over in Acts. And also, it's not girlfriends going house to house like patio to patio. Where do we get the phrase house to house in the New Testament? It's not that it's just one Greek phrase, but you get this sort of repeated reference to how is the church meeting? They are meeting in homes. And so if Paul's concerned that young widows are going house to house, speaking nonsense that has magic-y nuances, it does sort of make you go, could we be talking about the church and the occult, which comes right out of Acts 19? And we have tended to think magic and Artemis are two different forces, but the inscription suggests that no, they're connected, that Artemis is part of the occult and the magic is part of the whole shebang.
Dude, it's amazing how when you start to get these connections and when you start to build out the narrative and the new data, like how much it just makes more sense to look at it and see, well, there's this problem because again, like Paul is really good friends with Priscilla and Aquila, right? He is writing to patronesses and respecting their authority, even though asking requests, very respectful. In the same way he does to men like Philemon or something like that.
Correct.
In the New Testament. Yeah. And so you're looking at this, and you're like, wait, there seems to be a really stark change that Paul has when he's starting to make this universal thing. Hey, no women can speak in the church. They can't, whatever. But, and you're just like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
And this makes so much sense to think there's now this essentially heresy or kind of false teaching
falsehood,
that is focused in these female groups because of the culture of Artemis in Ephesus. And they're coming in and they're essentially, I don't know, and maybe you can speak to this. What were they attracted to the church? Were they attracted to the kind of authority they might be able to have in the church? I mean, what's your theory as to what, so they're spreading magic, but even that is kind of general. What were they doing? How did they get into these churches? How were they gained access and were able to speak even at that level? Because you'd have to assume, even if they're able to speak, then it was already assumed that women could speak and women could teach and women, or they might have been driven out, or I don't know. But what do you think? What was, so they're coming in, but are they preaching? Are they taking over services? What is happening?
Great question. I think it's hard to imagine our way back to a world where there is no such thing as a church building, and the word church is not synonymous with a building. I think the best parallel might be to our living room groups or our small groups, maybe a big small group, where you're going to have women that are going to be giving a prophecy. They're going to be speaking for God. They're going to be praying. Men and women alike are going to be doing that. We know that from 1 Corinthians 11. And again, we have tended to focus on what are the head coverings instead of, wait, what? He's just assuming they have to do something with their hair because he's
Right.
assuming they're going to be speaking to and for God. The early Christian movements that we know about had so many women prophets that kind of got shut down and it ended. But so there are a lot of women in the early church. First of all, the church doesn't believe in abortion, and it doesn't believe in letting a child lie there and die. So Christians are picking up baby and lots of baby girls. So I think when we read reference to widows and orphans, they should not be separate groups. You have widows taking care of these orphans that are the church's orphans. And so if you have a widow, then you have orphans. uh,
Wow.
they're just go together. We have some of the early writings talk about widows and orphans going to the prisons to feed Christians. So you just see them together. And so even when it talks about widows who have raised children, it may not be their own children that they've been raising. It's that they have made it part of their task to raise up the people that have been abandoned. And this is a world where, if the father didn't own his child within a certain amount of time, you could leave the kid to die. And the church had none of
Yes.
that because it valued human life. So that I think it was more that actually than I think it was women said, "Oh, there's this new authority that I can have." But certainly we can infer that Paul is teaching men and women because there are men and women in the church and they're speaking, and he's saying, "I'm not allowing." Probably a wife to authentain, whatever that is. A husband is not the usual word for authority. I think if you look at the AUT in English, we might be looking more at autonomy again than authority. We just don't know what the word means because it only appears one time in the New Testament.
Man, so this I have so much fun with this because I actually get to talk to really smart people that have, done this work and ask my questions. It's like a dream, and I love being able to do it. Yes, and I there's two kind of last questions, and this one I think is so important. You alluded to it before, the fear that these women have, but when we get this understanding. Right, there's this pastoral payoff that happens for Paul. Like you mentioned, he's a pastor at
Yes.
heart. His mind,
Yep.
he's thinking about these ladies. So when we see that phrase, the woman is saved through childbearing, what is it really saying to the women there?
The mysteries of the universe. Probably one of the top most contested. There hasn't been just one interpretation, and that's the challenge. So here are some options. One option has been she can't teach. A woman is not supposed to ever teach, ever, but her consolation is she gets to teach her own biological children. Okay, that's the
Gotcha.
new interpretations. Thank you, Protestantism, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't fit at all with Paul's view of spiritual gifts. It also doesn't fit with his practice, which is, you alluded to, Romans 16. I think we need to read 1 Timothy 2 and the limitations in concert with Romans 16 that outlines Paul's practice. He's thanking his co-workers. He's thanking Rufus. His mom was like a mother to him. He's thanking Phoebe, who's his patroness and who's a deacon at the church at Cenchrea. And he mentions Andronicus and Junia, Junia, through many early centuries of the church. More recently, she got a sex change and became a man who was not an apostle. But if you read some of the early fathers, they think it's remarkable that she's a female and called an apostle. So another option for what 1 Timothy 2 and say through childbearing means is that he actually is borrowing a quote from Artemis worship, perhaps, because it says, but she will be saved through the childbearing if they basically continue in the faith. And she and they in Greek is grammatically improper, except that Paul is a very good grammarian, so he's doing it on purpose. But quotation marks don't exist in Greek, so you have to try to figure out where's Paul borrowing a quote. So then you have to ask, Does Paul do that a lot? Does he borrow a quote and then put his own Christian spin on it? Paul
Yes.
loves to do that. It is good for a man not to touch a woman, quote, nevertheless, let everybody have his own wife. He does it a lot. And I think that's what's happening here. And a reason I think that's what's happening here is not just the grammar. The very next line is, this is a faithful saying. And we have read that as the first verse of chapter 3. We've given it a paragraph break and a big fat 3 in front of it.
Yeah, we have.
The original manuscripts didn't have the numbers and they didn't have the divisions. It's an interpretation to cut it off there. And I think he has taken a saying that is not a faithful saying and made it a faithful saying. And it's about being saved. A third option, this is one held by my dear friend Andrew Bartlett, who wrote a book on men and women in ministry, is that it's a reference to Christ and his birth. That we know when will be limited, but they'll be saved through the birth of Christ. My challenge to that is men are saved too. How is this a consolation to women? And also, usually the reference is saved through his death. Although the Orthodox believers would probably say, no, it's the whole kit and caboodle. So there you have it. Those are the options. I'm not going to die on the hills. But I am going to say, wow, are we going to limit a whole lot of the gifting in the church based on a little phrase from Paul that we've given in pretty new interpretation? I don't know. It doesn't seem to fit with Paul's view of spiritual gifts. It doesn't seem to fit with his practice in Romans 16. He's clearly partnering with men and women. Yeah. It really doesn't fit with his
I like your interpretation.
Well, thank you.
It seems to make sense to me. I mean, it just does. And I'm a big data person. And when someone, obviously every argument, every case that we make is open to revision. It's open to new data. It's open to things that are coming in and challenges. But whenever I see like, hey, this is really the work that's being done to create this context, it makes more sense. That interpretation, it just does kind of to me intuitively. And I think that's really cool. Here's my last question. What are the implications for today? I mean, obviously, people could have drawn them, but what's your plea? What's your case? Like, what should we be stopping and starting because of
we can have confidence in the Bible that it's true, and we don't have to be looking for pseudo Paul if it says Paul. Again, that's not a hill to die on, but come on. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's important to look at Paul's approach to ministry and learn from that he's looking at the landscape of the city he's in, and he's saying, what are their greatest pastoral needs? I'm going to address their greatest fears, and always Jesus is better. Look at the strongholds. Is it greed? In America, it might be sex and greed. Jesus is better. He offers a more beautiful story. He offers more beautiful fulfillment. He offers better flourishing. And I think that's his approach with Timothy. I think also it's important to read the Old and New Testament to know that oftentimes the New Testament is the commentary on the Old. And if we don't have the Old, then we don't know. We're going to read a slavery passage without the Exodus and not get that God is the God who frees. So we need to read our whole Bibles, or listen to the whole Bible and listen to it in chunks, so we get the sense of the heart of God. And then certainly for women, I would start with, let's just get men and women at the table. Forget trying to fight over the pulpit. Let's talk about, do we have male and female greeters? Do we have men and women on the missions committee? Do we have men and women teaching fourth grade together? Are we modeling what it looks like to get rid of hierarchy in our relationships where we lord it over people, and instead are freeing people to use their gifts for the kingdom and supporting one another, encouraging one another, partnering with one another, acknowledging that we love and need each other without sexualizing relationships? We can do this in a way that's healthy and flourishing, and God knows the church and the world needs that kind of model.
I love that. That is so good. How can people get a hold of you or follow your work? And what do you have coming up?
So Sandra Glahn, the biggie is spelling my last name right, Glahn, sandraglahn.com. You can find me. I am also on Substack, same name. And I talk a lot about these sorts of issues on Substack. You can also find me on Instagram, Sandra Glahn, author. I butchered my own last name, Sandra Glahn, author. And then what's coming up is another book with IVP. This one is called A Woman's Places in the Story. Don't have a pub date yet for that, but looking at when we tell the story of God and we leave out the women like Tamar in Genesis, what are we missing? We leave out the midwives that are Moses's preface to his own story of deliverance. 5 women are saving him. 6 women are saving him before he ever gets to the burning bush. Why does he tell their story before he moves on to the rescue? So we're going to look at some of the women, not just women of the Bible, though. It's how women have been in the story, and we've lost a part of the story by just skipping their stories.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Sandra, for coming on, spending some time.
Great discussion.
Yeah, talking with us today. Yes, thank you. And to our friends, guys, go pick up the book. We will put links in the show notes for you guys to go check it out. But we definitely want you to read it. Nobody's Mother. Go make sure you pick that up and check out Sandra's website and support her on her Substack and all that stuff. And guys, we appreciate you and appreciate all of your support. Make sure you share this with someone you think needs to hear it so we can keep this stuff coming out to you. God bless, guys. Take care.